Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Kenny McBride and I'm joined in the studio today by my other host of Scotland at 7, Gordon Ross. Gordon, how are you?
I'm fine, Kenny. It's nice to be here. It's
It's
kind of strange to be here, the two of us at the same
yeah,
time.
I was just thinking that it's so rare that we're actually in here at the same time.
Yeah,
But we're here to look back at 2020 as I think we would all agree it's not been the best year we've ever had.
I think that would be a colossal understatement, Kenny. Yes, it's definitely not been the best year we've ever had.
So we're going to start, we're just going to go through the first 6 months of the year and we're going to do the other 6 months another night. But we start looking at January and it seems like such a long time ago.
Yeah, it
At the
does.
start of January, we were dealing with, for example, the huge forest fires in Australia. And at that time, I thought this year was going to be a year when we really started to focus on the climate and we really started to kind of nail that down, that we'd kind of seen how bad it could be.
Yeah.
And then by February, beginning of March, things had changed so drastically with
Yeah.
the emergence of the virus.
The world turned, didn't it, on the head of a pin virtually. One minute you're thinking, yeah, brilliant. You know, these forest fires and all of these other natural weather events are clearly showing that the climate's becoming more violent. And I shared your optimism at the time, Kenny. I thought maybe we're going to see some action now on climate change, but instead of that, we were stricken with a plague instead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there were a number of other things happened in January, of course. The Labour leadership contest began. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, lost the election in December of last year, just over a year ago now. And then the leadership contest began. Donald Trump's impeachment process began,
Yeah.
which seems to have been almost forgotten now after it kind of went so badly. But of course, the really big news in January was that the UK left the European Union at long last.
Yeah,
Boris
finally.
Johnson finally got Brexit done, at least
Well,
sort of.
Kind of, yes. He managed to get some kind of agreement, I think you could say, a divorce agreement, didn't he, with the European Union, something that they could both sign anyway, which said that Britain had left. And then, obviously, we've had this long period of arguing ever since about the finer details of that, which we are this very day now coming to the climax of, and nobody knows whether there is going to be an agreement or not.
Yeah, it's strange to look back at that time because there was a lot of feeling, and certainly the way that Boris Johnson was talking about it was everything done. He didn't want to talk about Brexit anymore. He wanted it just to kind of bubble away in the background.
Yeah.
As far as he was concerned, the big job had been done. We were out of the EU, and all we needed to do was work out a few details during 2020.
Yes. I seem to remember, who was it, Liam Fox saying that the next part of it would be the easiest trade deal they'd ever negotiated. And I wonder how he views those words now.
Well, yeah, it certainly hasn't quite been that. In Scotland, of course, there were a few symbolic decisions made. Holyrood decided to keep the EU flag flying outside the Parliament. I mean, a small symbolic move, but still quite a significant one, I thought, given that was a cross-party agreement.
I think so. I mean, the symbolism between Scotland and the European Union, I think, started with Alan Smith's when he stood up in the European Parliament and gave his speech and famously said, "We're leading, but we want you to leave the light on for us." And I think this, the idea of showing the European Union flag flying in Edinburgh was another symbol, basically saying that we are still here. You know, we still think of ourselves as Europeans, so don't forget about us. Symbols are important, especially in times of political instability like this, where we're looking for certainty. And the Europeans know that Scotland views itself as a European state, I think. It's been obvious to them for many years.
Yeah. And of course, the final day, of course, was the 31st of January. The First Minister on that day made a speech saying that basically independence was now inevitable. She saw it as an inevitability. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. And of course, there were some preparations began for an independence referendum at that time. The question was sent back to the Electoral Commission to be tested again. It does seem like there was a process getting started then that has now obviously stalled.
It had frozen, yeah. I understand that the question, which was referred back to the Electoral Commission so that they could determine its intelligibility, which seems strange considering it's the same question we had in 2014. Should Scotland be an independent country, yes or no? It's pretty intelligible, but I think it's more of a technicality because by the time we would get to this next referendum in the next term of the Parliament, the time scale for this this Electoral Commission examination of the question would have run out and they have to re-examine it. But my understanding is, from what Nicola Sturgeon was saying most recently, is that they expect the Electoral Commission to report just before next year's general election, so there will be a question approved by that time, as far as I understand it anyway. So it had stopped, it had been frozen out by the coronavirus. Basically everything had to stop for the time being until that was sorted out, but I understand they're working on it again now.
Yeah, so we will obviously see how that whole process goes, but also in January, the first time Broadcasting Scotland reported on the coronavirus was on the 20th of January when we reported that China had reported the spread beyond the initial outbreak in Wuhan. It was appearing in other cities and they were beginning their process of locking down the whole country. In what we saw from the small amount of footage that emerged from China at the time, it was an incredibly draconian process, but it did seem to make a difference for China.
Well, of course, many other commentators have said about China is the fact that because of the way the Chinese political system works, people will do what they're told. So if the Chinese government says you're staying in your homes for the next 3 months, then they don't have any choice in the matter. It's not a question of asking them to wear masks and politely requesting that they obey the rules. They have to obey the rules. Their political system is much more directly enforced than ours. So perhaps, despite the fact that we often criticise China for having such a draconian method of controlling its population, in this case, it actually benefited them.
Yeah. So going into February then, we had that interview, I'm sure you'll remember, we spoke to Viktor Rudenka, who's a Belarusian musician who had been touring China in January and had then been sent home. And he was, when he arrived back in Belarus, was told to go into quarantine for 2 weeks. Now this was in he arrived back, I think, on just the very end of January. Mm-hmm. We spoke to him while he was still in the middle of his quarantine in some relative's empty flat.
Yeah.
And it was obvious then, I think, that the UK was not maybe taking it quite as seriously as some other countries.
No, I think, I mean, to be fair to the UK, no other countries were taking it seriously because I don't think any country had ever imagined that there would be another global pandemic. I mean, the last one was in 1918 after World War I, the global flu pandemic, which killed 12 million people. And I think they thought it couldn't happen again. It's like the 100-year flood. They just don't think it's ever going to happen again, and people forget about it. And of course, in the United Kingdom in 2016, I believe, they carried out a pandemic drill in London to simulate how they would react in the case of a pandemic of influenza in this particular instance. And the organisers of that particular event said that they weren't prepared in any way and it would be a disaster. And that was neatly swept under the rug and forgotten about. Mm-hmm. And of course, what you're saying about Viktor Rudenko is the idea that Britain was basically just going, oh, that's not going to come here, that's somebody else's disease. It's very typical of the attitude of the British government. It won't come here, we're an island, There's this attitude that it can't happen here. But of course, it can happen anywhere.
Well, yeah, it certainly did happen here, but there was lots of other things going on. Of course, Donald Trump was acquitted in his Senate trial. That was always expected to happen. The Republicans are very much Trump's party, or certainly they were then.
Indeed, yeah.
That may be changing a little bit now.
And of course, they dominated as well the political landscape, so they were able to control the outcome of the impeachment.
Yeah. So that was one story, but there were a few things happening here in Scotland. Ruth Davidson was nominated for a peerage.
Yes.
So we now have Baroness Ruth Davidson.
Don't call me Baroness Ruth Davidson.
Ruth, don't call me Baroness Davidson.
Yes.
But there are a few other things happening in Scottish politics. The Scottish Elections Bill was passed, which expanded the franchise quite substantially.
Indeed.
Now, refugees, for example, in Scotland have a vote. It expanded the franchise quite a bit, and I think that's a really positive move for democracy.
I would agree. Would I be right in saying that they expanded it to include people in prison on parole? Not prisoners who've been convicted, I don't think. Right?
I can't remember. There are some restrictions on prisoners, but
I believe if you're on remand, on remand, not parole, on remand, I think you were allowed to vote. So that was also a change. But yes, refugees, why? Why shouldn't they be allowed to vote, especially if we've accepted them as refugees?
Yeah, absolutely.
They become de facto citizens.
Yeah, so that was a really positive move, I felt. One of the more negative things that happened in Scottish politics was, of course, the resignation of Derek Mackay.
Yes.
I don't think we want to go into any great depth on
Unfortunate
that,
circumstances for Mr. Mackay, but I think he resigned, he did the right thing, and he sadly was a victim of his own behaviour, although his behaviour was not as bad as some politicians we've seen in recent years, I dare say. There are far worse cases than his, but he's now, I think, I understand he's standing as an independent at the moment.
He sits as an independent. I don't think he's expecting to stand the election next year. Yep. But another politician resigned. David Steele resigned from the Liberal Democrats in the wake of the child abuse inquiry that showed that he had not handled accusations against one of his party colleagues. We don't want to go into too much depth about that either.
No, I understand.
David Steele, of course, had been the leader of the Liberal Democrats when Cyril Smith was accused of child abuse and had done very little about it. When that evidence came out,
fell on his sword.
He fell on his sword, yes. But when Derek Mackay did resign, Kate Forbes came into post as the new Scottish Finance Secretary. And poor Kate Forbes,
2 days
thrown into that, and 2 days later she had to present a budget when the UK government had delayed and delayed and delayed the UK budget, meaning the Scottish budget was so difficult to produce for her, and yet she managed to get it done with aplomb. I think a lot of people were very impressed with that, for just to step in at such short notice. And she's very young as well. She's only in her 20s.
A remarkable feat. I mean, even for an experienced politician, that would have been a terrifying job to try and produce a budget within 2 days. Now, politicians have help from civil servants and from special advisors when it comes to things like this, but for somebody of her age and experience to turn that around in 2 days after basically just being literally dropped in it in that way is remarkable. But as we were talking about just before we came on air tonight, Kenny, that the fact that Miss Forbes is almost invisible a lot of the time, that I think, maybe I don't know if you agree with me, is because she works so hard. She doesn't spend a lot of time in front of the cameras because, as she proved in that first day, in her first 2 days in the job, that she works hard. She gets things done. And very few politicians you can say that about, particularly in Westminster, who can work that fast.
Yeah, and I mean, given the other chaos that's gone on during the year, I think Kate Forbes is one of the politicians who deserves a lot of credit.
I was going to say, contrast and compare her with Rishi Sunak's handling of the coronavirus furlough scheme and the lack of any help at all for the self-employed, which he persisted in ignoring all the way up until the very last moment possible before he finally caved in and offered something to self-employed people, of whom there are millions of self-employed workers in the UK, mainly thanks to the way the Conservatives have destroyed bigger industries, have left a lot of people in the situation where they've had to create their own employment, but not to give them a safety net and to make everybody suffer for so long. I thought Sunak's behaviour was lamentable. Thankfully, he has improved marginally since then, but even so, he still keeps putting time limits on this help that he's giving to people in coronavirus, and that is wrong. Fundamentally, these payments that are made to people who are forced to basically give up working because of the coronavirus should be open-ended. Because we don't know when the coronavirus is going to be under control. We don't know how many more lockdowns there will be.
No. Of course, we did see a few cases starting to emerge in the UK in February. We had a handful of cases appearing. On the other side of the Atlantic, though, it is worth mentioning that in February, Harvey Weinstein was convicted in a New York court of offences against women. Harvey Weinstein was one of the first figures in the Me Too movement to be named and shamed and then brought to justice. Do you think Harvey Weinstein's getting Harvey Weinstein's scalp has been a big moment for that movement?
Yeah, I think it was a seminal moment. It was a turning point for particularly for women who are trying to work in the creative industries. You'll remember the term the casting couch from years ago in Hollywood, when it was an accepted practice that young starlets would sleep with the director to get a part. And Weinstein took this to extremes. I mean, he was a loathsome creature, probably one of the most disgusting versions of this casting couch that I've ever heard of. But certainly his subsequent conviction for this, I think, was a vindication of a lot of people's hard work, a lot of women's hard work to bring him to justice. It takes a lot of courage to face somebody like that, and to take part in essentially a class action. Many people accusing him of the same thing. So yes, I think it was a very important moment for working women everywhere.
So we roll into March then, and on the 2nd of March, Scotland had its first confirmed case of COVID-19. March was when things started to change in the UK.
When it began.
And of course, Scotland, we saw those first few cases at the beginning of the month. We'll talk a lot about COVID throughout the rest of the show.
It's hard to avoid it, Ken. It's hard to avoid talking about it.
But at the time, did you think it was going to get this bad?
Frankly, yes. Yes, I did think it would get this bad, because a disease which spreads as easily as this and there is so little known about it, because it is a new disease. That was the key thing. We used to say the words novel coronavirus, and people used to wonder what you were talking about. What's novel about it? Novel just means it's new. It's new to science. And because it's new to science, nobody knew how it would behave once it got into the wider population. And we're only discovering now how many times it can mutate in such a short period of time, because the new coronavirus strain, which has emerged in the southeast of England, has 17 mutations. That's inside a year, 17 mutations. So every time it transfers from one host to another, it mutates again a little bit. It's genetic code rewrites with a tiny flaw in it somewhere. And one of these you get enough of these tiny flaws in the same area of the RNA, that can cause a major change in the structure of the organism. And so this is what we're seeing. We're seeing a new version which is much stickier, apparently. It's able to attach itself to human cells much more readily, and therefore it's far easier to catch it. In other words, fewer particles of it can easily infect you, whereas before it was more difficult when you had only a few particles drifting around. Now this new strain, this is obviously why there is the panic with countries shutting their borders, which is something I'm sure we'll return to later in the programme, Kenny, shutting borders. But yes, I did fear that it would get out of control, and I was more concerned that we should shut the border. And I know we'll be talking about that later on as well, Kenny.
Yeah, well, of course, in March, we were already seeing quite bad situation developing in Italy and in Spain.
We could see how bad it was getting and how quickly.
And we still, it took us until the middle of March to consider lockdown here. Well, I mean, I think it's generally quite widely agreed now that the decision of the UK government not to lock down until so late is one of the reasons that the UK had such a bad initial outbreak, isn't it?
I think that is an established fact. I don't think anybody would dispute that now. But again, you can contrast that with the approach taken by New Zealand. Jacinda Ardern's government took a very brave step to shut everything, to shut the entire country down, to shut all its ports, all its airports. And she took a lot of flack for that at the time, but she stopped it. And I think New Zealand is still COVID-free as a result of that.
Yeah, they've had a total of 25 deaths, a country with
total.
roughly the same population as Scotland.
The other thing I think, Kenny, about this is that one of my criticisms personally of the Scottish government, and I'm not usually keen to criticise the Scottish government without any cause, was that we were waiting for Boris Johnson to decide something for us instead of taking unilateral action ourselves. Our own government could have done this, I believe. And I know that many people across Scotland wish they had and expected the Scottish government to take some kind of action to close airports, to close the borders, or to check people coming across. Didn't happen. And I felt that we were waiting, if you like, for the grown-ups down south to tell us what to do for too long.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the financial implications are one of the real problems there. But
Indeed.
yeah, that was something that I think a lot of people do regret now. At the same time, though, China in the middle of March announced that it had no more local transmission of the disease. Their lockdown had been effective, and the only cases they were getting were people bringing it back into China from elsewhere. I mean, it does show that even with a huge country like China, you know, with some huge, massively densely populated cities, it was possible to lock down and to eliminate the virus, or virtually eliminate the virus.
Yes, but you need a strict lockdown.
Yeah.
In the UK, and in fact, I would say, or would suggest, in many of the so-called Western democracies, there is not a tradition of ordering people to do things. We ask people to do things. We request them to do things. We prohibit things. But unless these prohibitions are actually enforced, there will always be a sizable minority of individuals who refuse to do it. On a point of principle, they say, well, you know, it's my human right not to wear a mask. You're annoying me. I want to get on with my business. Why shouldn't I do this? We don't have that tradition of respecting authority here that they do in China. It's a different culture. And I think we suffer because of it, because many people just will not accept rules, even when they're in everybody's best interests.
Now, there were a number of other stories related to COVID. The Prince Charles came north, for a wee jaunt to Balmoral, and then tested positive for the virus.
Yes.
Once he arrived. That did not do a lot for the popularity of the royals in Scotland, did it?
No, I think I compared it to spreading royal jelly at the time. It was the idea of the royal family being so elite and so far above the rest of us that they didn't have to obey the rules. And it was quite okay for Prince Charles, who clearly was displaying symptoms of COVID-19, and he knew it, and his retinue, who also were infected, to all hop on a train and travel up to Balmoral and infect everybody else up there, and then cause an entire COVID-19 team to have to go to Balmoral to deal with this, when really they should have been there protecting the rest of the people. So again, it's the old story, and it's one rule for those at the top and a different rule for the rest of us.
Yeah. There was also a lot of criticism of the Foreign Office for being unhelpful with British citizens who were stranded abroad, people who were in countries that were locking down and they couldn't get a flight home. The Foreign Office came in for a lot of criticism about that. Sorry, I thought you were going to say something.
No, I was just thinking about what you were saying. Yes, they did, but it didn't really occur to them to perhaps charter a plane and put all of these people together in one place to keep them separated from the rest of the country's infrastructure. It can be done. It's just that I think there is always this thing in British politics, British civil service. They're always waiting for somebody further up the food chain to say it's okay to do something, rather than taking the initiative and actually doing something that works and risking perhaps the opprobrium of them upstairs. Nobody does a thing. And we're waiting for people in Whitehall to make a decision. And we've seen how inept the people in Whitehall have been.
Yeah. The UK government, of course, also refused to join the EU ventilator bulk buying scheme. This was quite controversial at the time. The EU had got together, as they do, to cooperate and buy in bulk, get a better price on these things. And the UK government decided not to. They claimed at first that they hadn't seen the email, which seemed a bit unrealistic. And then it did later emerge that it had just been a straightforwardly political decision. They didn't want to be seen to be doing anything that relied on the EU after Brexit.
Bizarre. The fact that they would put Brexit above the health of millions of people is just bizarre. But that's what Brexit is. It's an ideology that trumps everything, including human lives at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And the UK health authorities, the medical officers and so on, predicted a worst case scenario for the UK of 50,000 deaths.
Oh dear.
And as it stands today, we have over 80,000 deaths in the UK confirmed.
So Britain has punched above its weight, as usual, but in a bad way this time. Mm-hmm. So I think the current figure is somewhere well above 70,000, approaching at least 80,000 deaths now. Yeah. So we're looking at, that's about 60% higher figure than their worst case scenario.
Yeah, and it's clearly not over yet, as you say, with this new variant that we've seen in the last few weeks. But we move on now, and we look at April. And April started with a bang for the UK government when Boris Johnson got COVID-19.
Yes, and I, like millions of other Scots, were desperately worried about him. Mm-hmm. And, I had every sympathy for him. Well, a little bit of sympathy for him. Yes, that just goes to prove, that diseases do not respect class, they don't respect authority, they don't respect people's positions of power, their wealth, or anything else. And yet we're still seeing Boris Johnson's father cavorting about without a mask daily in the news, and it goes virtually unremarked.
And Johnson, of course, was one of those who had said, we'll take it on the chin, we'll just let it go, we'll get herd immunity.
Yes.
And when you look at world leaders, we've talked many times on the show about the success that female leaders have had around the world. Female-led countries in general seem to have done a lot better than male-led countries. But interestingly, Johnson, Trump, Bolsonaro, and Litvinenko, what's the name of the leader in Belarus? His name escapes me now. These four, authoritarian... Lukashenko, yes.
Sorry, I'd forgotten that as well.
These authoritarian kind of strongman type leaders who said, this will never affect us, this is not a problem, and all four of them ended up getting it.
Yes, ironic, isn't it? But then again, Boris Johnson, when he made this statement about herd immunity, showed just how undereducated he is. Because everybody who's ever heard of the word herd immunity, who's researched it, even the slightest, knows that you can only get herd immunity with vaccination. Yeah. It doesn't happen through getting sick. It happens when you vaccinate 60 to 70% of a population. Yeah. Boris Johnson, unfortunately, a bit like Donald Trump, seems to get all of his knowledge from television and, I don't know, perhaps comics like the Beano, for all I know. But he doesn't seem to get his education in the way that you and I have, through books and perhaps actually learning from proper science.
Yeah, well, it's the government that's had enough of experts, isn't it? In April as well, we saw the NHS kind of ramping things up. We saw the Louisa Jordan coming online. Nursing and medical students were kind of drafted in to help cope with some of the extra pressures on the NHS. But there were other kind of less good news things. We saw, for example, the scandal where PPE was only available to care providers in England. Scottish providers were not able to buy it. Now, there was a lot of confusion about that at the time. It did get resolved quite quickly, but I think it highlighted for a lot of people the problem of the UK government actually, when it comes to public health, only being the government of England.
Well, of course, health is a devolved issue, and I suspect that knowing the kind of jobs worths that inhabit the middle sections of the civil service, particularly in England, they would not see it as their job to help procure PPE for people in Scotland. That's devolved. We'll let the Scots deal with that. But the fact that I think the message that emerged, I think it was a memo that was seen, if I remember correctly, Kenny, said not for the NHS in Scotland. It was not to be made available. I think that was the shocking thing. It was the fact that it wasn't just that they had forgotten about us or assumed that we would do this ourselves. It was the fact that we were very specifically saying, don't give this to Scotland. That was the shocking thing.
Yeah. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, Donald Trump was furious with the World Health Organization. He claimed that they were on China's side, they were covering up for China, they couldn't be trusted, they were lying about everything, and he was threatening to withdraw funding from the World Health Organization. Now, the US obviously is one of the major funders of the WHO. It's one of the richest country in the world, and that, it can only push them towards kind of China and other wealthy countries that can support them. If the US kind of withdraws from that, Trump doesn't seem to see how the world works in that way, does he?
No, Donald Trump, I think, had two problems with this. One was that he got his knowledge of pandemics from the China Syndrome, the movie. And the other thing is that he's a protectionist. His stated policies were, first and foremost, America first. You'll remember that slogan that he used to use, making America great again, America first. So everything was about keeping jobs in America. That's what it was about. And so monstering China in some way like this, and monstering the WHO in the same breath, suited his political narrative to do this, to make it seem as though that the World Health Organization was taking sides against America in favor of China. And I don't know why Donald Trump has such a big thing about China, but he seems to be of the opinion that China is the new enemy. And if there's going to be another war with America, it'll be with China. And he's decided that he's picked the team already. China's the bad guys, and everything Chinese is bad. So if the WHO is not singing his American tune loudly enough, then they must be on the side of the Chinese.
Yeah, the WHO, I mean, they have no kind of power, really. They have the only way that they can influence governments is through kind of being nice to them. So
persuasion and science.
Yeah, they tend to kind of praise the good rather than criticize the bad. It's just the way that they operate.
Yes, they work on the basis of persuasion rather than saying you're bad for not doing this. They will encourage you, yes. Which
is probably one of the reasons they didn't criticize Trump very severely either.
Possibly.
In April, the WHO said that it would be at least 12 months to get a vaccine online. In March as well, the Oxford vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, began its human trials.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most remarkable things we've seen this year is just how quickly these things can get done if there's the political will and the money put in place to get it done.
Yeah, certainly. The money's been there. I'm not sure exactly what the spending level was. I heard somewhere, I can't remember where, and maybe need to fact check this, that about £200 billion had been given to the major drug companies to actually make this happen. It wasn't a bottomless pit. There was a finite amount of money, and it was shared between these organisations, these big pharmaceutical firms, to give them the financial impetus to just get on with it without worrying about the cost of investing in it. But interestingly, virus vaccinations are a well-known science, very well-known science. And the three that we've got, the two that have been approved, or one that's been approved and one that's about to be approved, the two that are based on the RNA messaging system, which is basically a fragment of the DNA strand of the virus, which is synthesized. It's a fake, used in a solution which, as we know, is unstable when it gets above a certain temperature. Those vaccines can be synthesized really quickly because they already exist. The carrier methodology is already developed. They just simply need to do the DNA work on it. So that's why they were so fast. The AstraZeneca vaccine is based on a deactivated virus. It's a much more traditional type of vaccine, and it means growing virus cells in the laboratory, and have to be done in huge huge vats to produce enough of this, and then enough of these have to be doled out. It does obviously have the advantage of being a room temperature vaccine, pretty much. They can keep it refrigerated and it can travel anywhere. So it's a massive advantage if you happen to live somewhere hot or in a third world country where you can't get access to freezers. But it's taken longer to develop it. And its human trials were marred by a mistake. And the mistake that was made apparently was that when they gave it, first of all, I think they gave it in 2 doses. But they also gave it in 1 big dose as well. And they discovered that 1 big dose only gave 60% effectiveness. But 2 doses, a weaker version and then a slightly stronger one, gave 90%. But the problem was they only discovered that because of the mistake. And therefore, it wasn't a legitimate bit of planned research, so they have to do the whole thing again, which is annoying, but they'll get there.
Yeah, we certainly hope so. We also in April we saw the first businesses kind of go under as a result of this. Oasis and Warehouse, 2 clothing retailers, closed in April with the loss of 1,800 jobs. Now we've seen several businesses go under, especially retail businesses. It's just been a nightmare year for them. Do you think that maybe this is kind of the real beginning of the end of the high street, or do you think on the other side of this people are going to be desperate to get out and shop as normal, and we might see a revival of high street?
I think what's happened in the high street is the traditional monopolizers of high street retailing in clothing, sportswear, not so much in food, that's a slightly different retailing, but the sector which deals with goods was always moving from the high street onto online. It was doing it gradually up until now, but now COVID has vastly accelerated this. So what we're now seeing is a movement from on the street to online very, very rapidly because people can't get to the shops. That's forced it. But the other problem is that we now have a monopolization of the online market by companies such as Amazon. Amazon have hoovered up virtually everything, and there's virtually nothing that you cannot buy on Amazon now. You could buy a car on Amazon now and have it driven up to your door. Somebody ring a bell and put the keys through your letterbox and run away. That would have been impossible before COVID. It would have been virtually unthinkable. But it does, I think, point the way ahead to the future. I think what will happen is we'll see the monopolies moving from the high street onto online, into the cyber world. And what we will see, if the high streets are going to survive, is specialist smaller shops moving back into the high streets and occupying these sites which are going to be cheap because nobody else will be able to fill them. There won't be these big stores anymore on the high street, so something else needs to fill the vacuum. And you know what nature's like, it abhors a vacuum. As soon as there's a space in the market for something else will move in there. I hope so. Hope I'm right.
Certainly. Of course, the virus is not the only thing that was happening in the world.
Thankfully.
In April, the US Democratic primary process to select a challenger for Donald Trump concluded. There had been a few dropouts after the first few states, but then in the middle of April, Bernie Sanders finally gave up the ghost and left the race. And Joe Biden was selected. Now, obviously, it turned out that was a good choice. He won a convincing victory over Donald Trump.
Yes.
I know it broke the heart of our dear friend Chris McCusker, though.
Yes, Chris, I'm pretty certain would have been rooting for Bernie as an old socialist. So yes, it probably broke his heart. But on the other hand, as far as the Americans are concerned, Biden was the perfect choice. He was the antidote that America needed to Trumpism. He brought America back from the madness that it had been engaged in and back to something that people could recognize as political discourse again, and not fake news and not wild stabs in the dark and sudden changes of policy on Twitter. I mean, nobody had ever seen a president who conducted international policy making by Twitter. It just never happened before Trump.
One of the interesting things about Joe Biden, though, and I wonder how things might have gone if the timing had just been slightly different. Joe Biden was not proposing universal health care.
No.
Bernie Sanders was. And it seems almost unbelievable in the middle of this pandemic that the richest, most powerful country in the world can't guarantee health care to all its citizens.
And it still can't.
Yeah.
There is a strangeness in the American psyche which says that there must be a big private sector health sector. It must be huge. There's too many people with money tied up in it. There's too many people with investments tied up in it. And of course, it's run by insurance companies who are making a fortune out of it. American medical treatment is up to 5 times more expensive than it is here for an ordinary working person. And that's why, unless you are working for a company which can provide you with medical insurance, you can't get any medical treatment other than the very most basic, was it Blue Cross they call it, where you get a kind of very basic treatment, but only if you're dying.
Care,
Yeah.
Now back in the UK, Priti Patel faced a tribunal over bullying.
Yes.
One of her former civil servants. This was the second accusation of bullying that she'd had during the year. There would be more later, and we'll probably talk about that in the next show when we get on to the second half of the year. But it was just an indication, wasn't it, of the kind of culture that Boris Johnson was allowing to develop in Whitehall.
I think as far as he was concerned, Priti Patel was doing the job he wanted her to do, which was keeping everybody in line. Priti Patel, interestingly, despite denying this bullying allegation, went on to apologise for it. Now, you don't apologise for something that you haven't done. And I think that was an admission that there was something there. I can't remember whether I think it was a woman who had brought the case against Priti Patel. It was a co-worker anyway, or a subordinate. I can't remember whether she won her tribunal or not. It was not clear to me whether she actually won the case. Yeah. Well, but I'm pretty sure if Priti Patel had to apologise for it, that she must have got a settlement.
Well, we don't want to dig too deeply into that. As I say, we will get back to Priti Patel.
I can't comment, any more accurately. I'm assuming
we'll get back to Priti Patel later in the year. But the other thing in April was the 75th anniversary of VE Day.
Indeed.
Obviously, this was a major anniversary, and in Scotland, it was kind of marked quite somberly. There wasn't much fuss made about it. In England, we saw street parties. It was the VE Day celebrations, which was something I don't think I'd really seen before, this celebration of war that we saw then. And particularly the street parties in the middle of a pandemic, just when the UK was reaching the height of or at least the height of the first wave of the virus. It seemed like such a terrible idea.
It was bizarre, and there was just this massive dissonance going on south of the border. People would get caught up in this jingoistic fervour about a war that had ended, 75 years previously, which they didn't even take part in, and they can barely remember the grandparents who actually fought in it. But there's this need, I think, in people south of the border to celebrate anything to do with the war that England had any role in, and also to hang the bunting out, to have an excuse to wave Union flags and to have tea parties. This is all part of the sort of English cultural identity that these celebrations must happen. There must be Spitfires flying over, trailing red, white and blue smoke. It is something which is just so alien to people in Scotland that we just don't say it. Perhaps it's just our Calvinistic sort of outlook that we don't like to celebrate the end of a war, although, it was the end of a terrible period in European and world history, and everybody was massively relieved. The idea of just having a street party in the middle of a global pandemic because of that just struck me as absolutely nuts, frankly.
Yeah, I pretty much agree. We roll on into May now, though, and at the start of May, the Scottish Government launched its Test, Trace, Isolate and Support programme. Now, that was something that there was some criticism of the Scottish Government cutting off its contact tracing around when there were still round about just 100 cases or so in Scotland.
Yeah.
They'd kind of reached the capacity of what they could do
Without
without training new people.
Yeah.
But by the beginning of May, they'd got that back up and running. Again, the English system took a lot longer to get up and running. It was something that seemed to be very effective in Scotland initially.
It was, and I think because the Scottish approach to it was much more pragmatic. It was employing people to actually contact people who'd been in contact with other people who tested positive. Now, it's a very basic thing when you're dealing with any kind of outbreak of the disease, that you have to physically contact the people who have been in proximity to infected persons. Now, that has never changed, actually, in all pandemics. It always happens. But instead of that happening in England, what was happening was they wanted to give a contract to a friend's company to create an app on the phone which would help them to trace people. Now, that's a very different approach from actually just saying, let's employ some people, lots of people, to track and trace this disease, and which is what the Scottish Government decided to do, which is a far more effective way of doing it than giving a bunch of money to one of your chums who happens to own a company that develops applications for phones. That's a totally different approach. I dare say we'll talk about the British app, COVID app, eventually at some stage, either on this show or the next one.
We will discuss all kinds of things. In May as well, quite near the beginning of May, the UK overtook Italy. We mentioned Italy a wee bit earlier, where the crisis was incredibly serious, and it's where a lot of cases around Europe were seeded initially from kind of skiing holidays in the north of Italy. But at the beginning of May, the UK overtook Italy with Europe's highest death toll, and I don't think it has fallen below first place since.
No, as far as I know, we are still the European leader in COVID cases, and it's not something to be proud of. It is a great source of shame, I think, for everybody in this country that we have had allowed this disease to get out of control in this way, when it could so easily. I mean, as we were discussing earlier on, so many different basic things could have been done and should have been done if we had been watching what had been happening, for example, in New Zealand, and thought, whoa, that's working there. That's what we should do. Instead of which we're waiting for Boris Johnson to say, well, actually, I'm going to just have an app for this. And my chum, Rupert up here, who's got a company that does phone apps, it'll be fine, and it'll be a great British app.
And it's notable, isn't it, that every country in the Schengen zone closed their borders.
Yes.
People who worked in one country, lived in another, had to get special passes to cross into the other country. It was quite a major step for those European countries to take, and yet the UK, which had voted in 2016 to have the right to control its own borders, was the only country in Europe that didn't close its borders.
Yeah, and I think the remarkable irony and the sad irony is that even when we were a member of the European Union, we had the right to close our own borders even then. We still have that right now. We've had the right to close our own borders for decades, before we joined the EU and afterwards. The Schengen zone, we didn't join it. The open borders policy of Schengen was to allow people in one country of the EU to cross borders into others without checks. And that was really to make it easier for people to move cross-border for jobs and work. And that worked fine. But as you said, Kenny, I mean, if the European Union's 27 nations could shut their own borders and start controlling the crossings, why wasn't the UK government doing the very same thing when it is a bloody island and it's in the middle of the sea? It could so easily have done that. And this is what Brexit is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be to give us the right and the ability to close our borders to people from outside. And yet the Tory government's refusing to do it, despite the desperate need for it.
And speaking of the EU, the SNP at the time was calling for an extension to the transition period, saying this is not the time to be piling, problems on problems. Let's get the pandemic over, let's extend the transition period and we can take a breath.
Yeah.
The EU said they were open to it. UK government said not a chance.
No, and we know why this is, Kenny, because Brexit trumps everything else. Brexit has become the most, what shall we say, it's the biggest obsession in British politics that there has ever been. And I believe that, unfortunately, it doesn't matter how many people die from COVID-19 or how many jobs are lost or how many truckers can't get home, as long as we get Brexit done.
Now, the other really big story in British politics, of course, was Dominic Cummings.
Oh,
Dominic
yes.
Cummings going for a drive. He fled to Durham, then went for a drive out to Barnard Castle to test his eyes.
Yeah.
And then the UK government, the entire UK government, seemed to go into protect Dominic mode. What do you think was going on there?
I don't know. I think Dominic Cummings seemed to have this Svengali-like personality, and he had this, I don't think he has it now, but he had at the time this reputation as being the sort of Rasputin of Downing Street. He was the man who was pulling Boris's strings. He was the one who was orchestrating the entire Brexit orchestra. You know, he was making it all happen. They couldn't let Dominic Cummings be hurt by something like this. So they circled the wagons, you know, and it was fine because he was just testing his eyesight. It was okay, you know, perfectly all right to be fully infected with the disease and drive up to a local beauty spot because you're worried about your eyesight.
Now, Gordon, I don't know how many of our viewers know that you are a driving instructor
Of course.
in your spare time.
Very little spare time I have, Kenny, yes.
Just for the record, is that an adequate way, an appropriate way to test your eyesight?
No.
Okay.
If he wanted to test his eyesight, he just needed to step out onto the street and try to read a number plate at 68 feet or 22 metres. If he couldn't do that, he should have stayed at home.
Yes. Across the Atlantic, though, there was some really tragic news. George Floyd, man who was being arrested for allegedly passing a forged $20 bill, died at the hands, but under the knee of a police officer.
Yeah.
That knee on his neck stayed in place for almost 9 minutes. It was filmed, the video went viral very, very quickly and sparked the huge Black Lives Matter protests across the US and also here in the UK as well. We mentioned a wee bit earlier the Me Too movement that started back in sort of 2017 and culminated with the Harvey Weinstein conviction and ongoing kind of reforms around the world, ongoing movement to try and protect women. Do you think the Black Lives Matter movement is going to take that same sort of shape? Do you think this is going to be a turning point for society?
I think what George Floyd's death actually did was it provided a fulcrum, a turning point for Black America, which it hadn't had up to that point. To a large extent, police brutality and extreme violence against Black people of all kinds who have not necessarily committed a crime. Actually passing a forged banknote unknowingly is not, as far as I remember, in American law, a criminal offence. It can be a misdemeanor. But to have somebody pin you down like that because you gave a banknote to a shop where you've been shopping every day for decades and where the shopkeeper said to you, I think that's a forgery, and you actually phone the police and say, look, I think I've passed a forged note. To have a police officer come along and kneel on your neck till you're dead is just a massive amount of excessive force. Now, what it did was, and like a lot of things these days, social media shines a spotlight on these things. They've been hidden for many years, but there are so many people with camera phones now that it is impossible for any police officer, white police officer in an American city of any kind, to get away with that now. Unscathed, but there is a difficulty. I think you and I have discussed this before, Kenny, that police officers in America are protected from, they're indemnified against deaths caused by their actions. And their union has, basically built this safeguard into their job descriptions. It is very difficult for an American to successfully sue a police officer, a black American to sue a white police officer for this. And until the American government changes the law regarding in police-involved deaths like this, nothing can change. But maybe it will now. Maybe there's a chance that the Black Lives Matter campaign can get that changed, but they're going to have to keep pushing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And back in Scotland, the last poll that didn't show a majority for independence was published. It was one that we had an exclusive on. It was produced for Wings Over Scotland by Panelbase, and it gave a precise dead heat. Exactly the same number of people polled said they would vote no as vote yes. And that was the last time any poll showed a majority, the last time any poll didn't show a majority for independence.
Yes.
There's been a big change in public opinion in Scotland, hasn't there?
Yeah, 17 polls in a row, all showing independence support above 50%. I think the most recent one showing 58%, which is a record-equaling number. For many months, in fact, it's been assumed, I think, by the Scottish, I was going to say the Scottish government, but the SNP, that they're really looking for independence support to rise to about 60% or above for a number of months before they feel safe to go for a referendum. Now, we're approaching that level now rapidly. I think this has been a year of turning points. We've just discussed a whole series of them there. This will be the next one. And it's interesting that it was Wings Over Scotland that were the ones who were at the pivot point, who were at the point where it became equal. And then after that poll, it started to rise. So despite what people say, good and bad about Wings Over Scotland, it has played a role in this. And despite, obviously, Stuart Campbell, who is the editor and the owner of that blog, having opinions on different matters that people don't share, he still performs a valuable service, because until that moment, Stuart Campbell had been debunking unionist myths for decades, for years and years, and was central to that effort. I don't know how effective he's going to be now, but it's interesting that was his blog that actually provided that turning point. Yeah,
it was certainly interesting. But we roll into June, and at the start of June we saw the Black Lives Matter movement kind of touching the UK. We saw, for example, the statue of Edward Colston pulled down in Bristol.
Yes.
And we saw, I'm not even entirely sure who it was, but somebody went round Glasgow and hung up signs renaming several of the streets that are named after slave owners around Glasgow.
Yeah.
What did you make of that, and do you think there is a case for Glasgow particularly, seeing as that's where we are just now, to look at some of these streets that are named after slave owners and maybe not change the names, but maybe acknowledge somehow how those people made their money?
Yes, in a word, I think there's a strong case for this. I'm actually in favour of changing the names because, like the protesters who pulled down the statue of Colston in Bristol, that statue, it represents a dark piece of history, of British history, and the street names in Glasgow likewise represent a dark period in our history where slavery was an accepted method of making money. And I think, in the current climate, and given what we've just been talking about, Black Lives Matter, if we want to really make Black Lives Matter, then I think we have to do something that shows that. And taking a little step like changing a few street names is hardly a big step to take. It's not very expensive. And as many people have said, the best place for the statuary of these slave owners and the nameplates which name streets after them is a museum to slavery. Acknowledging the fact that we used to call our streets after slave owners. Now we don't. I don't see anything wrong with that. In fact, I think that is the first step to atonement and the first step to trying to acknowledge the role we played in basically enslaving other people, which is obviously something that nobody should do, ever. And I think black people have had to live with the the long-term racial ramifications of it, particularly in America, where they're still, to a large extent, viewed as second-class citizens. They're still 5 times more likely to be arrested. They're up to 10 times more likely to die as a result of being shot. And, you know, it goes on and on. I'm not sure, it's obviously not as bad as that in the UK, because we don't have the same gun laws, but by the same token, there is still racism rife across the UK. It is just not spoken about.
Yeah, yeah. So in Scotland, we saw free school meals extended. In the middle of June, it was announced that free school meals would be offered throughout the summer to kids who needed them. Of course, we've seen in England, it took a campaign by a Premiership footballer to get this to happen.
A black footballer as well.
And I think, again, it shows just a wee bit of a kind of cultural difference, that this was something that the Scottish Government kind of did almost without thinking about it. It was just, well, that's what we need to do.
Yes, that again is a difference in cultural attitudes. We, in Scotland, have I think, a sort of national gestalt, a feeling about poverty, and a view of it that it shouldn't exist, and that where it does exist, there ought to be steps taken immediately to fix what's wrong. And in the absence of a big fix to fix poverty, you have to provide what's needed for those people who are struggling. And the most obvious one is to feed children. And we also have heard recently that the UNHCR has announced, is it UNHCR, who have announced that they are having to introduce a feeding programme for poor children in the United Kingdom for the first time.
It was UNICEF, but yeah.
I beg your pardon, anyway. But this goes to show you that there is a difference in the way the two governments operate and the standards to which they operate as well, in terms of what they are prepared to allow people to suffer. In Scotland, we don't let our people suffer, or we try not to.
Well, on that note, there was in June the tragic incident at the Park Inn here in Glasgow, where Badreddin Abdallah Adam, an asylum seeker from Sudan, who had been cooped up in the Park Inn since the beginning of the pandemic. A lot of asylum seekers were moved into hotels for no very good reason. And he then lost his mind and stabbed 6 people.
Yeah.
This was just a week after another, I was about to say inmate, which is effectively what these
Indeed,
asylum seekers were.
Prisoner.
Had killed himself. This was a real kind of, I hope, a turning point in how we think about refugees.
It is, but then again, this is another problem manufactured by British immigration policy. It's not the policy of the Scottish Government to coop people up in hotels because they don't have anywhere else to put them, even if it were a beautiful hotel. But it wasn't. And, these things are glorified guest houses, and people were crammed in pretty closely together with nothing to do, nowhere to go, and no money, and no hope. And to treat people who have come from war zones and places of strife where they've been traumatized, and to not even offer them the basic human right of, first of all, having some psychological assessment made to see how they've been affected by their experience wherever they have fled from, first of all, before deciding where they should be placed. But the problem has not been to do with the Scottish Government. It's been to do with the fact that the way contracts are awarded for placing these refugees has been awarded to a private company. And the private company is motivated by money. So they look for the cheapest possible solution. We'll stash them in there. That's fine. They can stay there. Mm-hmm. They didn't check to see if these people were ill, mentally ill, or were distressed. They weren't interested. And again, this is a policy which wasn't of the Scottish making. It couldn't be. And yet we are still, as always, forced to pick up the pieces after another stupid British policy on immigration causes somebody's death, or many somebody's deaths.
Yeah, it was a really grave tragedy. We had Refugees for Justice on the show a couple of times to talk about it. Those are well worth going back and looking at if you are interested in asylum policy in the UK. There was also a real, almost a tragedy amongst the SNP group at Westminster. Amy Callaghan, who was elected for the first time in December in East Renfrewshire, famously to the delight of the First Minister.
Actually, it was Eastern Bartonshire.
Sorry.
Yeah,
yes.
she's actually my MP.
Yeah. So Amy Callaghan had a brain hemorrhage.
That's right.
Now, Amy Callaghan, lovely woman. We had her on the show just before she was elected. She's already a cancer survivor. And then to have a brain hemorrhage, she spent 4 months in recovery at the Southern Hospital here in Glasgow.
Yeah.
She's been through the wars, hasn't she?
She has not had her troubles to seek as Amy, and one of the main reasons I think she was so popular when she first started to run as a candidate for as our MP was the fact that she was such a fighter, and the fact that she had got through her cancer treatment successfully. And then again, after the success of being elected, is struck down again by something completely different and totally unexpected. You know, it's almost too much to bear. Anybody else would have said, you know, I give up, you know. But she's not like that as Amy, and she is back again. And the fact that she beat our Liberal Democrat standing MP was a great achievement. And I think it made my day when I found that out.
Well, we come to just the end of June now, and I was looking at the numbers as we were going back and looking through the what had happened during the year, and we haven't obviously touched on every story.
No.
But I noticed that at the end of June in Scotland, the last week, there were just 17 deaths in that week, including 4 days with no deaths.
That's right.
In Scotland. Yes. At the same time, though, Leicester was just being put back into a full lockdown. This was a kind of special decision. Boris Johnson had been in quite a rush to release lockdown, and then case numbers rose quite drastically in Leicester, and it had to be shut down again. And it's there where the curves started to turn and start creeping back up again. What do you make of just that process where we started to release lockdown, we started to release the restrictions, people started to get back to something closer to normal? Do you think it was too soon?
I just think that people had their expectations raised too high. I felt, as I said at the beginning of the programme, that I expected this virus to spread very widely and to be extremely serious. I did not expect it to disappear after a lockdown or two. It's just the nature of diseases like this, that they don't just vanish. They're always there somewhere. And as soon as you allow people to start mixing again, the virus starts to transmit. And it's a fact of biology that if you bring one human being in contact with another in close proximity, they will pass whatever virus they have onto that other individual. And this is something that we continue to live with because of the piecemeal approach to the lockdowns that we have. I think there is far too much attention being paid to not spending money to actually fix this. There's far too much attention being paid to how supposedly we are going to repay the huge debt that we will have for this virus, when it is patently obvious that the British government and the Bank of England can quite easily create the money they need to deal with this virus at no cost to themselves. After all, we have a fiat currency. It's a currency which is not based on any gold standard, and it's perfectly within the purview of the United Kingdom government to create the money that it needs to lock the entire country down for as long as necessary to eradicate the disease, as we said at the beginning of the programme, comparing us to New Zealand. New Zealand has a smaller population than Scotland. It could have run rampant, and I think you pointed out to me, Kenny, that how many cases did they have in New Zealand in total? How many deaths?
25 deaths.
25 deaths, right? Out of their entire nation of, 3 million or more, 3.5 million?
It's around about 5.
5 million, so about the same as Scotland.
To Scotland, yeah.
So they have 25 deaths. We are into, 4,000 and something now here in Scotland? Because we won't lock down because Westminster won't let us. That really seems to be what it boils down to.
Yeah. We will, of course, talk much more about all of these kinds of subjects when we get onto the second half of the year, which we'll have for you very soon. But that is all we've got for you this evening. So thank you very much for joining us, not just for tonight, for this review of the year, but also for joining us throughout the year. It's been quite a year, I think, for both of us.
Certainly has.
We were discussing before the show just how hard it has been to be coming and reporting every day on these deaths, reporting on the Brexit chaos. It's been a tough year for news, but it's been, I think, for both of us, are still a rewarding experience and something that I think we wouldn't have missed. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us throughout the year. As we always do, we would ask you if you can contribute to help us as we go into the new year. Please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and sign up as a supporter. Your money is what helps us do all of this. So if you're able to help us, then please do. If you can't do that financially, we understand, and the shows will always be free to view online, but you can still support us on social media. You can follow us on Twitter @BroadcastScot. You can like our Facebook page, subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find us on the Amazon Fire Stick. And then please do share the shows around with anybody that you think might be interested in supporting Broadcasting Scotland as well. But in the meantime, that's all we've got for you. So I think from us, it just remains to say good night and have a great Christmas.
Yeah, Merry Christmas.
We're going to play you out with a Christmas message from the First Minister. So have a great Christmas, and we'll see you again very soon.
I want to wish all of you a very happy Christmas. In doing so, I know that for many people, for example, our emergency services and armed forces, Christmas is not a holiday at all. And for many health and care workers, it will be another working day at the end of an exhausting year. I want to say thank you to each and every one of you. The entire country is so grateful for the dedication, expertise and compassion you have shown us this year. I also want to acknowledge that for all of us, this will be a Christmas like no other. As has been the case for so much of this year, the way in which we will show our love for each other is by keeping apart, keeping our distance from each other. That will be really hard for all of us, but it will be especially hard for children, for whom Christmas is such a special and exciting time. And so if any children are watching this, please know, firstly, that we have made special arrangements to make sure that Santa will still come to visit. And please also know that if you're missing people this Christmas, people you would normally see, maybe your granny and granddad, your uncles and your aunts, or other members of your family, they will be sending extra love to you. And please know, above all, that future Christmases will not be like this. Hopefully, this time next year, we'll all be looking forward to a much more normal celebration. Christmas can also, of course, be very tough for people who live on their own or for the less fortunate in our society. That's true every year, but that is even more so this year. That's why, if we can, even as we stay apart, we should also reach out to others. Almost all of us will be in touch with our loved ones by speaking on the phone, sending cards, or catching up online. And many people are giving support and help to those who most need it. Thank you so much to everyone who is doing that. One of the brighter spots of 2020, in an otherwise very dark and difficult year, is the way in which people have helped each other through this pandemic with kindness, compassion, and love. I hope that by holding these values in our hearts this Christmas, even in this most difficult of times, we can all find some much needed festive cheer. So I want to wish all of you all the very best for Christmas. I wish you a happy, healthy, peaceful Christmas, and most of all, a much brighter new year. Happy Christmas.
the Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.